Good evening, everyone. My name is Jason Foster. I'm the director of Parkland Institute, and I want to welcome all of you to our Implementing a Just Transition conference. I'm very excited to see that we have over 360 people registered for this conference over the next couple of days. That's very exciting. We had originally hoped to have the conference in person at the University of Alberta campus, but COVID had other plans for all of us in these last couple of months. But in a strange way, it may have been a bit of a fortuitous thing for the conference in that moving online has made it easier for people across the country to be able to join us. And so we have participants for the conference across the entire country and even a couple of people international, which is really exciting. So consequently, we've left the chat open. So feel free to introduce yourself, tell us where you're from. It'll be kind of interesting to sort of see that, and you can use the chat through the evening as a way to converse on the side. But like at all Parkland events, we both trust and ask that you'll keep all comments and conversation respectful. We've no doubts that good Parkland people know how to do that. This conference comes at a really crucial time. The world is in transition. Change is coming. Federally, we're expecting a Just Transition Act sometime soon. And tomorrow we see the latest budget from the government of Alberta. So there's lots of things happening. There's lots of ways in which understanding what's to come, we need to get our heads around. But too often, just transition is just a phrase. It's a concept thrown around to demonstrate that the person talking about it is committed to including workers and communities in the transition to a clean energy future. And so we need events like this conference to really dig into what does just transition mean and how do we effectively implement it. And so as governments start in Canada to design just transition policies in the coming months, and hopefully not years, but in the coming months and years, we need to both learn from other countries' experiences about what to do, and we need to talk in a serious way about what Canada needs to do to make just transition a meaningful part of the economic transformation that's underway. And so that is what this conference in the next 2 days is about. So because we always have to do these kinds of things at the beginning of a conference, before we get to the reasons why you're here, I've got to give some preliminary stuff. I want to start off by thanking the sponsors of the conference, because without sponsors, there are no conferences. First, we want to thank the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. We received a connections grant to help put this conference together. I want to thank the Building Trades of Alberta, the Unifor Prairie Regional Council, the Alberta Federation of Labor, and the Corporate Mapping Project, which was also another SSHRC-funded project that Parkland has been participating in partnership with CCPA BC and Saskatchewan, Bill Carroll, and a great network of researchers across Canada that's been doing some really good work. We also have 26 partner organizations who have helped to work on and promote this conference, and I want to thank all of them. Don't worry, I'm not going to list them. You can see them on your screen. And I guess the other sort of preliminary is we're very pleased to have a few elected officials who we've noticed have registered for the conference, which I just want to acknowledge their presence here during the conference. We have the MP for Edmonton Strathcona, NDP MP Heather McPherson, and we have the NDP MLA for Edmonton Gold Bar, Marlon Schmidt. He's also the NDP's environment critic provincially. And we also have a number of senior advisors for Federal Labor Minister Seamus O'Regan. And so we appreciate to all of them also joining us tonight. And because it's an online conference, usually if we're in person, we can spot the politicians in the room, so we can acknowledge them that way. So if we've missed somebody, please feel free just to put your name, sort of introduce yourself in the chat so we know you're here. So if we've missed anyone, we apologize. And before we turn to the main event tonight, I think it's also important that we recognize that all of us in Canada live on First Peoples lands. Normally here at Parkland events, we would have someone read a formal land acknowledgement. But in chatting this week with Elder Whiskey Jack, who I'll introduce in a second, we want to do something a little different. So tonight, we want all of us who are settlers on this land to recognize and reflect and consider the significance and importance of the land that we reside on. And if I think about that for myself, I think I too often take for granted this land that I rely upon and my existence is on. I think I take from the earth unthinkingly too frequently, and I don't think enough about how I can give back to the earth and into the land that I'm living on. And so with that, I know I need to do better, and I think we all need to do better. But I'm also hopeful, because I think about the fact that Parkland Institute is named after the ecoregion where we are physically situated. And I feel that embeds in the heart of this organization a commitment to honor and respect the land we are on and all of the peoples who have and currently live here. And so I would like to this point introduce Elder Francis Whiskey Jack. Francis is a Cree elder, he's a residential school survivor, and most importantly, he is a knowledge keeper for his people and for all of us. He's one of the elders at the First People's House at the University of Alberta, and he will offer us something of an invocation to start the evening. Over to you, Francis.
How do temptik Kauyatugukisi ko nitika sun nehionia nitskopo nehuje. So thank you so much for that introduction. It is certainly my honor, and really I find very honored to be here this evening. I won't be with you here very long this evening, but however, I would like to begin by doing things in a ceremonial, in a good way. Is the path that I follow in my survival and resiliency. Welcome to Treaty 6. What a wonderful way to express territorial acknowledgement from our host. You know, for me in this walk, I have found that life is so precious. Himatsuin, something we take for granted in a world of turmoil. I'm thinking right now of what is going on in Ukraine. I'm thinking of the floods that happened over the summer in British Columbia and the landslides. I'm thinking of climate change. As human beings, we do not control the elements, but we can control ourselves as people and caregivers of one another, but also caregivers of the land, the water, all these things that are so precious. Yes, they are life givers, but if abused, they can take life. Fire, Mother Earth, water, the wind. So with this, and today, I said I wasn't going to sing, but song moves the spirit. And we have a song that says, Mamutawi Mau, the creator, has said that life is so short, but in the acknowledgement of life to one another, we should always love one another. This many of our people have forgotten. And in this love, we should pass it on every day to our children, our future, because that's how fragile life is. As COVID goes around, taking many of our people to the spirit world, we remember the happy times in life, but also in our grieving times. So with this, I'd like to share this song with you as the creator that sang it. And we acknowledge the teachings of four: our spirit, our physical self, our mindset, and our emotion. Aho. with that, Mamutawi Mao Creator, I thank you for this life today and for everyone here that is listening. And thank God we live in a free country. What everyone has here is a gift that they can offer with their knowledge, with their experience, and with their heart. Hi, Manaskoman.
Thank you so much, Elder Whiskey Jack. We're very, very thankful and appreciative and honored that you did that for us tonight. I do want to just quickly acknowledge we did have one elected official sort of raise their heads in the chat, and I just wanted to make sure we acknowledged her. It is Jennifer Bose, who's the NDP MLA for Saskatoon University in Saskatchewan. So we've now got some cross-border officials with us, which is lovely. So tonight we're honored and excited to have three very knowledgeable speakers who are deeply committed to just transition and to helping navigate our economic transitions. And so tonight what we'll have each of them speak in turn for about 10 minutes. And then after they've done their comments, we'll try and engage them in a bit of a conversation. There will be opportunity for people in the audience to ask questions. The way that we're asking you to do that tonight, when the time comes, is to type your question into the question and answer, the little Q&A icon. You can type your question in there. I will see them and be able to kind of ask them as many of them as I can. If you really like a question, you're able to vote it up so that it stays on the top for me. So those are the questions that are really most pressing for people, I'll be able to see. I'll remind you about that as we get closer. But for the moment, please allow me to introduce our first speaker for the evening, Catherine Abreu. Catherine served as the Executive Director of the Climate Action Network Canada from 2016 to the middle of 2021. And before that, she spearheaded the energy and climate programs at the Ecology Action Centre, one of Atlantic Canada's largest and longest running environmental advocacy organizations. And today, Catherine is the founder and Executive Director of Destination Zero, an organization focused on climate action and the global energy transition. She was also appointed as one of the 14 advisors to Canada's Net Zero Advisory Body in early 2021, and she sits on the Advisory Council for the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. And in 2020, Catherine was awarded the Jack Layton Progress Prize.
Thanks so much, Jason. And hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me. Wow, it's amazing to see such a great turnout from so many different places today. Really want to thank Elder Whiskey Jack for giving us that opening. I'm calling in today from unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory in what is also known as Ottawa, Canada. A big part of my heart also lives back in Mi'kma'ki on the east coast of Canada, in Chibouctouc, Halifax, Nova Scotia. So I really give a lot of thanks for the time that I've been able to spend on these territories. So I just have a few minutes for my opening remarks, and I thought that I might actually ground my initial comments in two kind of personal stories. The first is a very recent one. So, here I am in Ottawa. I think most of us on the line will know what's been happening here in Ottawa for the last number of weeks. We have experienced an occupation that has come along with a lot of unrest and turmoil in the city. A lot of people, facing physical insecurity, a lot of threats, a lot of destruction of property. It's been a scary and disconcerting time. And I think a lot of us across the country have been trying to grapple with and understand what's happening here. And I've heard a lot of really brilliant thinking as people have been trying to grapple with this situation. And I just wanted to dwell on a few points that have kind of synthesized for me that I think we who are interested in making change, in ensuring that people are at the heart of that change and that we are taking care of communities as the change happens, I think we need to be paying attention to a few things that I think are going on here. I've of course heard a lot. I live and circulate in communities of people that often refer to themselves as progressives. And I've heard a lot of folks in progressive communities saying, hey, we've really failed. We need to figure out how we can do better at reaching people, at building community, at building bridges across different different organizing priorities. And I think that that is absolutely true. But I think what's also true is that what's been going on here in Ottawa over the last few weeks is not about a failure necessarily of the progressive movement. It is about power and the ways in which those who have power and who benefit from the status quo are weaponizing an insecurity that I think many of us are feeling in a time of turmoil to anchor and entrench their own power. And I think that is a really necessary place for us to be looking, because this time in Ottawa has been a reminder of how close to the surface in so-called Canada really hateful, colonial, misogynist, white supremacist ideology is. And I'm definitely not suggesting that these ideologies were held by all the demonstrators who occupied Ottawa in the last few weeks, no. But I am pointing out that what we saw in those demonstrations is an important reminder that those hateful ideas are alive and well in this country, and they will exploit opportunities to attach themselves to more mainstream ideas and movements wherever possible, so as to gain legitimacy and salience. And so those of us who, again, are interested in making positive changes within our community have to work to guard our communities and movements against these kinds of insidious, infiltrating ideas. We have to make our communities invulnerable to infiltration. And I say this because, for me, that's a big part of what Just Transition is all about. For me, Just Transition is not just about incremental emissions reductions and thinking through the tactical transitions that have to take place in the workforce. Those considerations are, of course, necessary, but for me, Just Transition is really about community building, and it's about thinking through how we can be stronger together and decide what our future is collaboratively. And that is about building our own power so that we can protect our communities and ourselves against destructive ideas that don't ultimately serve our own interests. I think also this situation in Ottawa really tells us where we need to work. We have been reminded of some of the weaknesses and injustices that are built into our social and economic systems. And so we've been given a kind of microscope, a looking glass, that points us in the directions of where we need to think through some really serious systems level change. And at that level, I think it's important that we acknowledge that these structural injustices that we find throughout our economic and social systems are the foundations of a whole host of injustices that we experience in our personal lives and in our communities, including ecological crises like climate change, as well as inequitable distributions of wealth and resources. And so it's only by working at that structural level that we can make lasting change, because at that structural level, all of those fights against injustices are the same fight. The other personal story that I wanted to share in my opening comments is about why I moved from the East Coast to Ottawa, why I wound up growing up in Ontario, despite the fact that my Canadian family is all from Atlantic Canada. And this is a story that I told in my little mini intro video that I filmed with Markham. So some of you may be hearing this for a second time, but my Canadian family is all from Nova Scotia. I grew up in Toronto, though, and that's because in the years leading up to the cod fishery collapse and the years following it, many Atlantic Canadians had to leave that part of the country to find work elsewhere. And so my family left Nova Scotia to find work in Ontario, and I was born and grew up in Toronto. And I moved back to Halifax when I was old enough to find my work and career and build my life there. And I really want to make sure that we don't have to see communities experiencing this kind of collapse and this vacuum that sucks people and resources out of the community to find work elsewhere, simply because governments saw the writing on the wall but refused to make a plan that helped communities work through and live through a change in the ways in which their natural resource sector was working. And this, of course, ties back to that insecurity that I was commenting on earlier, that I think has been really exploited, manipulated, and weaponized in the events that we've seen in the last few weeks in Ottawa. A lot of us are experiencing the rise of the gig economy, the growing inequality between rich and poor, the instability in global markets, the instability in global politics. And I feel that personally. I think many of us do. And we, instead of accepting the fact that we should be subject to these feelings of insecurities, that it's just the free hand of the market that's doing this, and there's nothing that anyone can really do about it or change about it. I think we need to be looking inward to that insecurity and feeling the power of it instead of the vulnerability of it, and joining hands to demand that those institutions that have decision-making and planning power take the time that they have to plan a transition that will not force people to leave the communities and the homes that they grew up in and find and make their lives elsewhere. And for me, what this really takes me back to is a great quote that Emma Jackson had in a great piece that she wrote recently, thinking through what the occupation has to teach us, where she talked about channeling the outrage that people are feeling in a constructive way. And a part of channeling that outrage in a constructive way, from my perspective, is really dismantling this myth of scarcity that a lot of us live with. This idea that there's not enough to go around and therefore we have to fight for what little there is. We know that there's more than enough to be shared. And that myth of scarcity is what works to divide us and pit us against one another. But if we instead refute that and try to acknowledge the abundance and hold on to the understanding that there are forces that are working diligently to divide us, then I think we have the opportunity to flip the script and say, no, we are actually going to work at that structural level to achieve the kinds of economic and social changes that we know are necessary to build a society that is based on compassion and mutual care. And imagine the transformative effects on individuals and communities that kind of society might have. And so these two pieces are what Just Transition is all about from my perspective. It's about community building, putting people at the center of questions around transition, economic and social transition, and rejecting the narratives and the power plays that seek to divide us. Because I think if we've learned anything in the COVID-19 crisis, it's that we really, in times of crisis, can rise to the occasion and take collective action that betters not only our personal lives, but the lives of everyone we love all around us. So these are just a few ideas that I wanted to start our conversation out with, and really looking forward to hearing others' thoughts and taking your questions later.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for getting us underway with those thoughtful comments. So now it's my honor to introduce you to Mayor Jyoti Gondek. She was sworn in as Calgary's 37th and first woman mayor on October 25th, 2021. Prior to being elected as mayor, she served as a city councillor in Calgary from 2017, and she holds a PhD in urban sociology and an MA in organizational sociology. Her professional background includes leading the Westman Center for Real Estate Studies at the University of Calgary's Haskayne School of Business. And she also ran a successful consulting practice for 12 years, helping clients in the energy and city building sectors evolve their business models to fit a changing regulatory and economic environment. And so without further ado, I welcome Mayor Gondek.
Thanks so much for the kind introduction, Jason and Catherine. You are a very tough act to follow. I appreciate your eloquence and your thoughtful comments. I reflected a lot on what I would bring as opening remarks when it comes to a just transition. And I thought about my early days as mayor. Actually, I wasn't even mayor yet. It was the day after the election when on the Ryan Jesperson show, I said, we need to move past looking at the outputs of energy production. And that got picked up as not even mayor yet and saying we need to move past oil and gas. Funny how people hear what they want to. And that was really that was the start of my tenure. So before being sworn in, I made national news by declaring a war on oil and gas is how it was positioned. And it's funny to me because that's not what I said. And I didn't go back and clarify that. I just kept talking instead about there's so much more to what we do in our city. There's so much more to what we do in our province. We are leaders in energy transition. We are leaders in energy transformation. And that's what we should focus on. And I'm glad I did that. I'm glad I didn't go back and try to, do the old, that's not what I said, because I don't think people would have listened to me. Instead, I stuck to what I said and kept moving forward. I was incredibly blessed to have a council that believed in the same thing. We then went into this explosive start to our tenure after getting sworn in, where we were going to declare a climate emergency. And there were so many people that thought the world would end in Alberta if we did so. And it didn't. We instead banded together as a brand new team and talked about all of the benefits that would come from declaring a climate emergency. And we passed this motion and, things just got better. Ever since we did that, I can tell you there's a few things that have happened. Calgary was already home to an energy transition center. And that declaration helped us get just over $3 million in federal funding for that energy transition center. I can also tell you that Calgary managed to crack the top 5 places to establish a clean tech business in North America. That was big for us. And the even bigger thing from that is of the clean tech startups that we have in our city, 51% are first-time founders, 28% are folks who were born outside of this country, and 23% of those founders are women. That reflects the kind of diversity that we were not seeing before. Also, after we did this climate declaration that was stressing everybody out completely, we heard yesterday that our provincial government is going to be investing some dollars into clean hydrogen as well as pathways to net zero. That's going to get announced tomorrow, so we'll see what that commitment looks like. We also learned that Winnipeg MP Jim Carr is bringing forward a private members bill that recognizes a green transition is an opportunity as well as a bit of a challenge for prairie provinces, especially Alberta. So what he is proposing, and I know he's spoken with Gil McGowan and probably many of you on this call, he's proposing that ministries work together at a federal level with provincial governments, with municipalities, with labor federations, with industry leaders, and that we band together to make sure that the green transition is something that is just and successful for everyone, so that it's something that can be sustainable. Those are the things that happen after you make a commitment to a climate declaration and a just transition. They're good things. And it seems that we can make this commitment and do this very big work on transition across sectors, across governments, and across political ideologies. So now that we know that, what's next? What are the other big steps that we need to take? And this is where it gets particularly interesting, because we need to understand things differently than we typically see them. We need to understand how labor organizations should be recognized for their fight to ensure that people are treated with fairness, instead of the polarizing debate that we hear all the time about unions versus management and private sector versus unionized sectors. That language is standing to divide us, and it's polarizing us. We should instead be thinking about the fundamental principles of labor movements and how they're starting to resurface. We are hearing a lot of people talking about a living wage. We are hearing a lot of people demanding that workers be given proper benefits that they be given things like bereavement leaves, that they be given proper mental health supports, parental leave. Those are all things that labor federations have been fighting for decades, if not centuries. So let's remember that dividing language is not going to get us to a just transition. We also need to recognize that concepts like benefits-driven procurement have to be rooted not only in economic practices of the partners that you're examining, you also need to look at the social and environmental practices. I know that we have a benefits-driven procurement policy at the city of Calgary, and it's one that hasn't really taken off the way it should because everyone's concerned about what it is that we should be measuring. We should be looking at economic implications, but we should also be looking at things like representation of marginalized populations within the companies that we may wish to work with. We need to look at climate mitigation practices that are being proposed by the companies we may want to do procurement with. We also need to recognize that a just transition can't come at the cost of those who are living in low-income situations and those who are living in positions of precarious employment. We have to make sure that climate mitigation options are not only available to people who have the money to put in solar panels or better insulate their homes. We have to make sure that affordable housing we're providing for folks is also providing them with those same options. We need to take care of everyone in a very equitable manner. And we need to show that a just transition is a way to take action on reconciliation. We need to ensure that we're not just paying lip service to things like land acknowledgements, which are incredibly important. I know that as someone who is a settler on Treaty 7 territory, but they have to be accompanied by development of places and spaces that are Indigenous led. One of the biggest things that we can do to actually have this type of a just transition is to create the relationships and connections that didn't previously exist. And I say that from a place of experience over the last 4 months. Municipalities traditionally don't have a great relationship with their private sector if they don't go out and forge that relationship. We are not seen as regulators most of the time. So for a city like Calgary, the oil and gas sector did not pay much attention to the municipal government because we didn't have a lot of sway over their operations. But once we made that climate declaration announcement and we started engaging with leaders in energy production, and we invited them to things like the Energy Leaders Breakfast, we started hosting roundtables, and we made a commitment to the same type of net zero action that they wanted to take. We found allies. And in finding those allies, we were able to go to the federal government and the provincial government and talk about how cities could be better supported so that industries could do the right thing and give back to the societies that we needed to create and strengthen. So I guess my challenge to all of us is when we talk about a just transition, we need to step outside of our own space and try to make connections with people that we haven't done so with before so we get this right. So thanks very much for having me on. I'm looking forward to hearing from everyone else.
Thank you so much, Mayor Gondek. Our third speaker today, before we get into our conversation, is Gil McGowan. Gil McGowan is the president of the Alberta Federation of Labor, Alberta's largest union advocacy organization. They represent more than 175,000 workers in the public and private sectors. Gil has been instrumental in putting many important issues forward for public discussion in Alberta. He's led public discussion and policy changes on resource development, climate change, green jobs, and a host of other important issues for workers in the province. And so, Gil, I hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jason. And thanks to everyone for joining us this evening. I'm thrilled to be speaking to a crowd from not just across the province, but across the country. And I'm just as thrilled to be sharing the virtual stage with people like Mayor Gondek and Catherine, who I've had the pleasure of working with on some previous net zero discussions. I'm here because I represent workers. In that capacity, over the last few years, I've had the privilege of chairing what we call the Coal Transition Coalition in Alberta, which was a coalition of unions representing workers who had been displaced by the phase out of coal. I also had the privilege of sitting on the federal government's Just Transition Task Force, making recommendations about just transition for coal workers. But I'm here mostly, as Jason said, in my capacity as president of the AFL. And for the last 17 years, I've had the great honor and privilege of leading that organization, which is the biggest worker advocacy organization in Alberta. So, it's literally my job to stand up for the interests of working Albertans. And so with that in mind, I thought it would be important for me to begin my discussion of energy transition tonight by acknowledging that oil and gas, the resource, not necessarily the companies, oil and gas has been very good to our province and the people who live and work here. For years, we enjoyed the highest levels of business investment in the country. We had the highest rates of economic growth, the highest rates of population growth, the highest average wages, the highest household incomes. Sadly, we also had some of the highest rates of income inequality in the country. Not everyone benefited from our many booms, but for a very significant portion of our population, things were good. Comfortable homes, new cars and trucks in the driveway, vacations to Mexico and Hawaii, quads for recreation. And perhaps most importantly, for many Albertans, there was a sense of security in the present and optimism for the future. It's also important to note that while inequality has been high compared to other provinces, our prosperity wasn't restricted to those at the very top. So it wasn't just CEOs, managers, and highly educated professionals who got the big salaries. It was also truck drivers and warehouse workers, it was mechanics and manufacturing workers. And of course, it was also energy workers and construction workers. And all of this wealth and prosperity was built on the foundation of our publicly owned natural resources, especially oil and gas, and since 2004, especially the oil sands. But all things come to an end. And make no mistake, the beginning of the end of our amazing ride with oil and gas is upon us. You may have noticed that when I was talking about the impact of oil and gas on our economy, I used the past tense. That's because the energy transition in Alberta has been underway for nearly a decade now. Investment in our oil and gas sector has dropped from a peak of about $182 billion in 2014 to $27 billion in 2021. Direct employment in the sector has also fallen and not recovered from a peak of about 190,000 jobs in 2014 to about 140,000 jobs today. So this is not another trough in the familiar boom and bust cycle. It's a fundamental structural shift. The roller coaster has been replaced by an exit ramp. Of course, not everyone agrees. The energy transition has become a battleground for competing political narratives. For example, our Premier, Jason Kenney, has been peddling what is essentially a conspiracy theory. Mince words about that. It's a conspiracy theory that says foreign-funded environmentalists and Alberta-hating elites from Ontario, BC, and Quebec are turning global investors away from oil and gas in general and the oil sands in particular. But the truth is, and we know this, that the changes that are buffeting our provincial economy are not the result of some conspiracy by some shadowy forces to landlock our oil. It's something else. Yes, the global transition is being driven in part by government policies to address climate change. And this is as it should be, with our planet facing an existential threat caused by climate change. And it's important to point out that these policies are supported by the vast majority of Canadians, including the vast majority of Albertans. But the energy transition is also being driven by market forces and technological change. For example, it's being driven by the fracking boom in the US, which has flooded our traditional markets and made our oil and gas less economic. It's being driven by dramatically lower prices for renewable energy, which makes the transition to alternatives of fossil fuels not only possible, but profitable. It's being driven by the accelerating shift towards electric vehicles, which will soon start eroding global demand for oil. And it's being driven by investors who quite legitimately worry that investments in oil and gas projects may become stranded assets. So from a worker perspective, facing these unprecedented and long-lasting shifts in our economy and our labor market, what should we do about it? As you can imagine, I have a list. If you bear with me, I'm going to summarize that list. So first, we need to stop lying to people. Fear tactics, blame games, and finger pointing may make good political theater, but they're no substitute for a plan. Our leaders have to start being straight with the citizens that they serve. Second, we have to start making a distinction between the interests of corporations on the one hand and the interests of citizens on the other. In the energy transition, what's good for Suncor, Cenovus, and CNRL is not necessarily what's good for workers and citizens. They are trying to save themselves. They are not trying to save us. Third, we have to be wary of political narratives, even if they're comforting. So, for example, the oil and gas sector's new narrative is that they accept the energy transition and that, but that will take many decades to unfold. This is unlikely to be the case. I want to stress that. We're in the midst of an energy transition, and if anything, it's accelerating. So we shouldn't accept these kind of comforting narratives without question. Fourth, we have to acknowledge that delay doesn't just have environmental costs, it also has big potential economic and human costs. First movers always have an advantage when there are big economic shifts, and laggards fall behind and often can never catch up. We can't afford to let that happen to us. Fifth, we need to be skeptical of oil companies touting technological solutions. The oil sands industry, for example, is leaning heavily on carbon capture and sequestration to meet their net zero promises, but they want the public to shell out $50 billion to pay for it. Given the record profits that these companies are currently enjoying as a result of what I think is going to be a relatively short-lived increase in prices, we should ask, if this is such a good idea, why aren't they paying for it themselves? And we should also ask, is this really the best use of public money during an energy transition? Sixth, we have to acknowledge that the burden of the energy transition will not fall equally on all Canadians. Some regions are going to shoulder a bigger share of the burden, especially oil and gas producing provinces like Newfoundland, Saskatchewan, and of course, here in Alberta. These regions and the people who live in them are going to need more help to navigate the transition than others. So if public money is going to be spent on the energy transition, and frankly, it needs to be in large amounts, then it should be proportionate to the need. Seventh, we can't rely on the market to sort things out. The change that's underway is so big and it's happening so fast that individual companies won't be able to deliver an orderly transition. Without a coordinated response led by government in consultation with workers, business, and the community, people and regions are going to get left behind. Eighth, and perhaps most importantly, we have to make sure that the energy transition is a just transition. The phrase just transition, which is the title of this conference, it's been thrown around a lot. There isn't a universally accepted definition of what it means. For some people, it means labor market adjustment policies for affected workers. That's necessary, but not sufficient. That's what we did here in Alberta when we in the labor movement negotiated a sector-wide just transition package with the previous provincial government for workers who lost their jobs as a result of the coal power phase out. We talked about, we were able to win a package that included things like training allowances, pension bridging, relocation allowances for people who had to move from one community to another. And there were also supports for communities there. And I'm proud of that, but it wasn't enough. For others, just transition means something bigger. It means a bigger economic transformation that will provide opportunities for everyone. And I want to make it clear that when we in the Alberta labor movement talk about just transition, we're talking about both things, both worker adjustment and economic transformations. But the key for both, whether it's adjustment policies or the economic transformation policies, workers and citizens have to be at the center of the conversation. During the Q&A, I'm hoping that I'll have an opportunity to flesh out what we in the Alberta labor movement would like to see on both fronts, because we have a lot of ideas. But for now, I'm just going to conclude by saying this. The world is embarking on the biggest peacetime economic transformation since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's going to affect every sector, every region, every corner of our economy. The question is not if change will happen, but how fast. And it's already clear that it's happening a lot faster than a lot of the defenders of the status quo predicted. So this is going to bring massive uncertainties, but it also brings massive opportunities for government, for business, for labor, and for civil society. This is a moment for leadership, and for the sake of our fellow citizens, we all need to rise to the challenge. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Gil. I appreciate those thoughts a lot. What we're going to do now is we'll kind of shift over into a bit of a Q&A. So hopefully you'll be able to see all three of our guests. And to give people a moment or two to be able to formulate their questions and type them in, I thought I might just kind of lead with an opening question to all three of you that may hopefully kind of get a conversation started. One of the things I noticed is that all of you really focused around the word just, and you came at it from different directions. But it's clear that all three of you have a sense that just transition has an element of justice in it, whether that means justice for workers, whether that means about also paying attention to vulnerable and precarious members of our communities, whether that means kind of trying to understand this in a broader sort of political struggle. And so I wondered maybe if each of you could take a moment, just a minute or two to sort of maybe flesh out for you what that sense of justice in just transition means, and what that might then therefore in a practical way look like when we try and design policies to make it happen.
I think there's a lot I could say about this, but I feel like I can summarize it really succinctly by saying, for me, justice is when decision makers and policies are designed to protect people and the planet instead of profit. And I think that is a whole lot of what many of us are working toward, right? As Gil said, there is this paradigm, right? It's this kind of like assumed thing that what's good for private companies is good for the people who work for those private companies. But we have seen a lot of evidence to the contrary. And in fact, over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, billionaires have gotten richer and richer. Canadian billionaires have made billions during the pandemic, whereas working people have continued to struggle, to suffer, and to bear the majority of the burden for responding to the pandemic. And we don't have government, we don't have a system of institutional measures that come in to correct that. Right? We don't have any way of talking about the problematic nature of, rich companies getting richer while workers and communities struggle and while the planet burns. And so I think, in short, that's what justice means for me, is correcting that.
I think justice is an incredibly noble goal. It's going to be really hard to get there. Creating a just society will take a lot of work. And the biggest thing that we have to overcome and get past is that we want people to be in neat little boxes. We want people to be environmentalists. We want them to be left-leaning. We want them to be allies and advocates. And anybody that doesn't fit into our neat little boxes, we want to put them on the other side. And as soon as we start othering people, we run into a lot of trouble. And I know that's not a popular thing to maybe say, but we can't make every person in the energy sector part of the problem. We have to find the people within that sector that can help, people that truly do believe that a transition should be just. And I worry that sometimes we get so embedded in this narrative of polarization that we will isolate people who truly could help us. So I think our biggest challenge will be to make sure that we find the right people in the right places, places where we traditionally wouldn't look for them, and get them to be on the side of justice and get them to move the people that the rest of us can't necessarily influence. And I don't know if that makes any sense, but sometimes you find allies in strange places if you just look for them. And they're people that might be quiet because they think there's no one that's going to stand up with them. But we've got to go and seek them out and bring them on board.
For those of us in the labor movement, just transition has a very particular meaning. In fact, the phrase just transition was coined by unions in the energy sector in both Canada and the United States. And we saw this coming a long time ago. We knew that the world was going to start moving away from fossil fuels, and that there would be labor market implications for the members that we represent. And so, the first thing that we acknowledge is that climate change is real. We all have a responsibility to do something about it. It's a social goal. It's a social good that needs to be pursued. But we also recognize that the pursuit of that social good, basically saving our planet, the costs associated with the pursuit of that social good are not borne equally by everyone. There are some industries, and then there are individuals and regions that have to do more. And just to put that in context, Canada has set emission reduction targets for our country, and they're laudable. But there's absolutely no way that we will meet those emission reduction targets without Herculean efforts across the country, but especially in the oil-producing provinces like Newfoundland, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. Like here in Alberta, we have 12% of the population, but because of our energy sector, especially the oil sands, we produce about 40% of Canada's GHGs. So there's absolutely no way we'll reach our targets without big changes in these particular provinces. So for us, justice is making sure that the people in particular sectors, they're going to carry they're going to do a disproportionate share of the work, but they shouldn't be disproportionately punished, and it has to be recognized and supported. So that's why we talk about labor market adjustment for workers who are displaced as the economy moves on. So, like the things I talked about in my opening remarks, like, supporting workers with training, with job search, with pension bridging, all those kind of things. As a labor movement, our thinking has evolved too, because on this question of just transition, because in addition to justice for the workers who are displaced and affected in the communities in which they live, there's also an opportunity to create a more just world in the process of transition. We're going to be creating whole new economies, whole new industries. It presents an opportunity not only to build prosperity and create opportunities for profit, but it also creates an opportunity to achieve social justice goals. That's something that I think that people beyond the labor movement can get really excited about. It's not just about helping workers who've lost their jobs. It's about creating a new and more just economy.
Great, thank you for that. I'll turn to some of the questions. There's a lot coming in now. I'm going to start with one that I think follows up on a theme that all three of you kind of talked about. So I'll throw it back to all three of you again. And this question is, and I'll read it out loud, is transition creates ambiguity and uncertainty, which in turn fosters fear and defense that will negatively impact any meaningful system changes. How do we help people accept and become comfortable with the transition?
This is something that I've lived through, especially in my role as the chair of the Coal Transition Coalition. And that coalition came together in the wake of the previous government, the NDP government, announcing the coal phase out. And it was a little bit of a surprise to us. And our members in the coal-fired power sector were horrified, because that's, coal-fired power plants, thinking that this was a lifelong career and that was stable. They chose to work in the coal-fired power plants and the associated mines because they thought it was going to be a job for life. And so their first reaction was fear, which turned into anger. And it took a long time talking to those members in those mines and in those power plants to bring them around to a place where they didn't want to surround the legislature with pitchforks and torches, right? Having dealt with that and doing a lot of reading around it, trying to figure out a way to help manage this situation, I came across this concept of loss aversion from behavioral economics. And what it says is that people will fight harder to avoid losing stuff than they will to gain things, right? That's what we're facing here, a huge loss aversion problem, especially considering that a lot of the jobs that are potentially going to be displaced have been some of the best jobs in our economy. They're family sustaining jobs, community sustaining jobs. People will fight to keep them. The challenge is, and this is what we found with our members in the coal sector, they need time to make peace with the change. And they need compassion in that process, and they need support. And we spent like months and months doing town halls in communities across the province, talking to the workers, their families, their friends in the communities. And part of the process was just letting them express their loss. And it wasn't until they had done that and it sort of gotten their heads around the fact that these jobs are gone and we're not going to come back, that they were able to come around to discussions about policy changes to help them move on. I could talk about this for a long time because it was a very moving and emotional experience for me, but at least part of the solution is recognizing this human tendency towards loss aversion and the need for compassion when dealing with it.
I spoke about compassion in my opening comments as well, and I think you're absolutely right, Gil, that it is such a necessary part of the equation, right? A lot of what people are experiencing here is grief. The grief at a profound change happening to the way you think your life is going to be and to the ways in which you provide for yourself and your family. It's so personal, it's so emotional. Of course, it is going to hit people right where we live. You're absolutely right, Mayor. I think that we need to be finding allies in unexpected places and championing them. Those of us in the environmental community, I think we often get accused of really demonizing workers and industry. And the reality is, when I make comments about the energy industry, it's not about the people involved in that industry, right? We're all looking for a good job, like respect to where you find your good job. But it's about the company itself and this notion, this confusion that I think we have because of the kind of political paradigm, this neoliberal world that we've all been swimming in for a few decades. There's this notion that private sector companies are somehow going to act in anybody's interest but their own. And that's just not how it's going to work, right? So it's not because the people who work in those companies are all evil. It's because that company is out to make a profit, and that is the priority of that company. We've seen that loud and clear as oil companies' profits have started to climb, and those profits have actually just gone right back to their shareholders and paying off their debts instead of doing anything useful in their community, like cleaning up abandoned oil wells, for instance, right? So it's not because the individuals are evil, it's because the private entity itself is not designed to work with compassion for people and communities, even if the people inside those companies do want to behave that way. And that's why we have government. That's why we have government that steps in to regulate industry, because industry is not going to do it to themselves. So I think along with the compassion equation, we also need a plan, right? It doesn't make it any less scary to be going into an unknown, but it certainly helps you feel more secure if you think someone's got a plan for you. And I think we have a right to demand that plan of our decision makers. The oil sands aren't an accident. They didn't just arrive and provide this prosperity to Alberta out of nowhere. The oil sands are a product of decades of planning and concerted investment by all orders of government to make the oil sands a reality. They are a scientific and technological advancement that is actually quite impressive, and it didn't happen all by itself. So we need that level of planning, of concerted investment by different orders of government, combined with coordination with workers, communities, and the private sector to make that plan a reality and offer that as a healing balm to the very real and understandable grief and anxiety that people are experiencing.
I think my colleagues have stated this very well. I will pick up on this thread of governments have a responsibility. I agree with you. One of the things that I have asked for in speaking with the federal government is when you are allocating dollars towards provincial funds that then get dispersed down to cities, maybe talk to us as cities to find out what we need, or as municipalities, I should be more broad, and we'll tell you where the gaps are. And then perhaps you can tie your funding to the types of things that we need executed. And so I was just looking through my notes from a couple of weeks ago. In speaking at the Big City Mayor's Caucus, there was a comment made that there's a need to restructure infrastructure bilateral agreements. And I didn't know that was the terminology for how they are giving dollars for infrastructure from the federal government to the provincial government, and that it previously wasn't tied to certain expectations, and now it is. Very recently, I think it was just last week, federal government made a commitment to operating dollars for transit to help us keep our transit systems whole, because we've suffered very much under the pandemic. But in order to get those dollars to flow, provincial governments have to make a commitment to affordable housing. I was very happy to see that. That was something that was tangible. So I agree with you that as orders of government, we need to work better together. And local governments are sometimes kind of discounted as the just fix the potholes and pick up my trash and stay in your lane. We can actually tell you what's happening on the ground because we are the closest to our citizens. And by citizens, I mean people who live here, not capital C Canadian citizens.
Thank you, Mayor Gondek. I think following up on that, there's two questions that I think ask basically the same question, so I'll read them both out. And I think I'll start with you, Mayor Gondek, because I think they're directed kind of at you a little bit. And one is, do you have a sense of what big city governments like Calgary can do to advance just transition? And what would be your list of priorities and tools? And then the second question was, there will be massive job creation in building retrofits and decarbonizing every sector of the economy. How can cities bring workers and their unions to the table to help design a good process for just transition and bring their wisdom to guide the implementation of climate plans? So I think both of these are kind of focusing kind of what your last answer addressed, which was maybe getting you to maybe expand a little bit upon that about what do you think cities and municipalities can do in their unique role. And then obviously if Catherine and Gil, if you want to follow up on that, you're welcome to.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that I've been doing to make sure we get this right is engaging with different stakeholders and making sure that I'm actually talking to people who have really good ideas that sometimes don't get heard because political ideologies get in the way. So I was open to talking with the building trades of Alberta during my campaign. I have met with them since I came into office, and I can tell you that it's those types of conversations that could spur us to think differently. And I'm looking at my notes about, if we take a green focus, it doesn't mean that we need to reskill our workers. It just means we need to put their skills to use in a different manner. So the idea that Gil had spoken about, that sometimes we scare people and we freak them out when we say we're going to transition or we're going to do away with a certain type of industry, we need to also instill confidence that your skill sets are still valued. You might need to tweak them a little bit, but we can put them to good use doing this type of work. And highlighting the types of things that are done in a way that it matters to people. So there's a high school training program that the Building Trades of Alberta deploy with any high school student in the province, where you can go and learn a trade and eventually get ready to get a trade ticket. That's attractive to parents. That shows them that there's value to thinking of the economy in a different manner than the way that we used to. So I think we need to bring our language down to a basic level that a family can get behind this idea of a transition, that a family can understand that this is going to be good for our kids into the future. So I think that's kind of the role of your local government, is to make sure that we're delivering that message of how the services we provide will be beneficial to you. And I think we just have not done a great job as municipalities of embracing change. I mean, Calgary didn't even participate in the energy efficiency audit of buildings. I don't know why. That's something that we want to get into. And that means more jobs, it means a greener environment, and it means a more sustainable future. So I think we have to take a good hard look at what we have not done as local governments and start deploying resources in that manner. And that takes electing good people who are strong enough to say, we have to change, we have to do things in a way that recognizes the climate emergency. We have to recognize that social equity is something that is dear and valuable to all of us. And we have to be advocates and push harder to other orders of government.
In my experience with the Coal Transition Coalition and then also with the Federal Just Transition Task Force, there was a lot of good work done developing policies to support workers who've been displaced by climate policy, especially in coal. But there was a gap. And one of the things that was missing both at the provincial and federal level, what I describe as active labor market policy. Like we here in Canada and most of the English speaking world, when it comes to labor market policies to support workers, including support them through transitions, we take a sort of very hands-off approach. Like we'll provide training, we'll provide some income supports and that kind of stuff. But when it actually comes to attaching a displaced worker with a job, they're basically on their own. It's sort of this free market approach, right? You know, we've given you some tools, out you go. When confronting a transition, especially one that affects the whole industry, not just losing their own job, but the industry in which they've worked and would have applied for other jobs in other places within that industry, if that's no longer providing the same kind of opportunities, people really need, what they really want in the transition is another job. You know, we look to places like Western Europe where they do a much better job at this, where instead of just, you know, handing you some training and a resume and say good luck, they actually will one of the roles of government and their administration is to connect workers with jobs, right? And so they'll find, you know, employers who might be looking for similarly skilled workers and they'll put them together. It kind of boggles my mind that we don't do more of that in Canada, but we should. And if the federal and provincial governments are not doing it, I actually think that there might be a role for the municipal governments, at least, especially those that are embracing this notion of just transition more. The other thing that municipal governments can do, two other things, is community benefit agreements. And this goes back to, and you probably heard this from my friends at the building trades in their conversations with you, but community benefit agreements are basically agreements attached to procurement policies that say if we're going to spend public money building, you know, an arena, building, you know, a public facility, that we're going to take it as an opportunity to meet other social needs, right? So if there's displaced workers that you want to place, maybe that's part of the community benefit agreement. If there are particularly groups of previously disadvantaged people who you want to give an opportunity to, like women in the trades, Indigenous people, community benefit agreements can be a real tool for, you know, better community outcomes in general, but especially in the context of the energy transition. The final thing I'll see, and it goes to Mayor Gondek's point, good things happen when people talk. In our province, for a very long time, when we had sort of a one-party government, and now again with the UCP, they don't talk, right? And if you're not talking, you're not learning. You know, like I've had the opportunity recently, and it's mostly, Frank, and I'll be blunt, it's mostly with roundtables that have been set up by the federal government, not the provincial government, because once again, the UCP is not interested in having people talk. But at these federal roundtables, including the ones that the one that Catherine was helping to organize, the net zero conversation at the federal level, they're bringing business people together with labor people, with environmentalists, with other civil society groups, and the stuff that comes up is just amazing. Right? Things that you never thought of. To your point, Mayor Gondek, you find allies that you didn't know were there. You know, I'm just a big believer in the synergies that come from circumstance, like let 1,000 flowers bloom strategy, right? And we need more of that. And if the province isn't doing it, then I think that's a role that perhaps the big cities especially could help with.
I'll make two quick points. One, cities are absolutely like one of the top three most powerful levers that we have as a global population to drive action on climate change. Cities are also responsible for contributing about 75% of energy-related greenhouse gas emissions globally. So if cities don't act, we're totally lost. Thankfully, cities are very much on the vanguard of ambitious climate action globally. And I actually think part of the power that cities bring to the climate conversation is the fact that it's not just about climate change. And in fact, we often see these conversations really siloed in other places of like, what are we going to do to mitigate climate change and drive emissions down? What are we going to do to adapt to climate change impacts? What are we going to do to, you know, address social injustices with social policy? And in fact, all those three things have to happen together. adaptation, mitigation, and social outcomes have to all be the intentional outcomes of good climate and environmental policy, in my opinion, and cities is where it's at on that front. And then the other point that I will make is that someone in the chat said something about really short-term election cycles. So when we're saying like we need plans, we need vision, we need leadership, what do we do about those short-term election cycles? And I'll say that the net zero advisory body that Gil was just talking about, in part, we actually exist to try to get around that short-term election cycle problem. And so I think part of the question to ask there is, what are the other sorts of non-governmental institutions that we need to establish in this country that will not be subject to those 4-year election cycles where some of that longer-term planning can happen?
This is a question that is designed as an Alberta specific question, but I think it applies kind of generally across Canada. And it's a question of how do we build an economy that provides good jobs throughout, they're saying Alberta, but I think we can insert Canada there, including the small towns, cities, and rural areas. I think that extractive industries have provided good jobs outside of the major cities. How do we engage people in these communities in this project? So I think this speaks really well to the fact that Just Transition needs to not just talk about cities, but also about that a lot of these smaller communities are where some of the good jobs are in terms of extractive industries. So I'm just wondering if any one of you want to comment on that.
I can tell you our own experience here in Calgary is that we are terrible at working with our neighboring jurisdictions. We have this sort of practice of, I'll duke it out with you to see where this thing should be located because there's a tax benefit, right? So when it comes to the best example I can give you is Rocky View County and Calgary are neighbors, and we should be working together. We should be coming up with ways that our airport and our goods movement strategy and the amount of money that we've invested in goods and transportation can be applied towards creating employment opportunities and, great places to live and learn in our shared area. But we don't do that. What ends up happening is that one of us drops our tax rate to try to attract someone to come to our jurisdiction. And we get stuck in this geopolitical battle over turf. And that's historically how we've operated. And I think what we need to do is get over ourselves in terms of tax rates and who's going to benefit from the uplift and start talking about regionally and provincially, what are the corridors that are going to create the type of trade opportunities that we are missing out on? What can we do locally in terms of manufacturing, whereas we've been farming it out to other places globally? What have we learned from the disruption of the supply chain that shows us that building local and being local actually matters? And we'll never get there as long as we have politicians who are worried about their turf. So you need to push us when we're running in an election and ask us what we're going to do for the good of the people, given the powers that we have, and get us away from thinking about those little boundaries that we operate in. So I would say to electors, ask us tough questions, ask us what we're going to do.
There is no doubt that the energy transition is dealing with a big divide between rural and urban. I grew up in rural Alberta, and most of the people who I went to high school with ended up working in the oil and gas sector, either as tradespeople or engineers, and those jobs afforded them security and a lifestyle that they were very happy with, and they're afraid that they're losing it, and they're facing the prospect of losing that security. The divides are deepening. We saw them on full display with the so-called freedom convoys, and I'm afraid that if we're not careful, the energy transition will be the next big issue that those shadowy forces behind the convoys will try to mobilize anger around. So I've been looking for rays of hope, and I actually found one in the most unlikely of places. I was reading some articles out of the deep Republican American states. What I saw were a bunch of Republican governors from rural states who were getting behind wind power, solar power, not because they were dealing with them as environmental issues or policies to address climate change, but rather because these industries were actually taking root in their communities and creating jobs. And so we might have to talk about it differently with people in rural Alberta than we do in the cities. Like in the cities, you can say, climate justice and that will be enough. But in rural Alberta, I think you have to use the language of opportunity, because a lot of these, renewable energy, for example, it's turned a corner. I mean, the costs have dropped to the point where they're more than competitive with fossil fuel alternatives. They're springing ahead just on economic terms. Whether it's wind farms or solar farms or geothermal in a lot of rural Alberta, there's a real strong economic case to be made for renewable energy. There's also a strong economic case to be made for things like building retrofits. People can be employed in rural Alberta and these communities that have traditionally been reliant on resource extraction. It needs to be promoted. I think there's an opportunity there for rural areas to power industry and development in the cities, and then there's a symbiotic relationship. And we just so instead of the divide, there's an opportunity for cooperation, and I think that we should look to support those narratives and those opportunities.
This question is phrased kind of as a Calgary focused question, but I think we should read it as a general question, and that's much of the reskilling, upskilling, and economic diversification efforts, and the questioner is asking, is saying in Calgary, but I think we can apply this question broadly, have focused on the tech sector. Are there other promising sectors that could benefit from similar investments in training and workforce development? I think this is probably a useful question in terms of trying to ask ourselves practically, like, how do we create these other kinds of jobs that are part of the transition?
If I would have come in on the last question, I would have said something like this. So decent segue. My academic background's in anthropology, and humans tend to have a very silver bullet kind of mindset. What's the one thing that's going to solve my problem that I can invest all of my hope and energy into? And the reality of this transition is that it's not just about one thing anywhere, right? It's about a whole bunch of different things changing all at once. And fortunately, that also means that there are a whole bunch of very different kinds of opportunities that come along, and we have to be visionary and creative enough to seize them. So we sometimes talk about the transition of okay, well, we'll transition fossil fuel energy workers to renewable energy. And in fact, it doesn't have to be that one-to-one kind of equation, right? It's not actually that linear. That there are many other low carbon sectors that are already existing in Canada that we might think about investing in and beefing up in order to create work opportunities. Now, I'm not necessarily talking specifically about a very concrete skill transfer here, but on a kind of macro level, can we say on the heels of the COVID-19 crisis that there's a huge opportunity to invest in our healthcare system, and that scale of investment in our healthcare system can create thousands and thousands of jobs across the country. Many of those jobs can also employ people who maybe were impacted most by the economic challenges of COVID-19, like women, for instance. So that's one idea of okay, how do we actually expand out from this? Let's just pick one sector and put all of our eggs in that basket, to thinking through a diversity of sectors across the country, also thinking about how we can keep people in the communities that they want to stay in instead of forcing this internal Canadian labor migration that we have going on. And then the second question that I would ask is, how can we make sure that people who are not currently benefiting from the way in which our economy works can benefit from shifts to that economy? And I think an amazing example of that is the ways in which Indigenous communities are actually on the forefront of renewable energy here in Canada. About 20% of renewable energy projects in Canada are owned and operated by Indigenous communities who have so far actually been dependent on very expensive, polluting diesel energy. I think those are two really necessary perspectives that we have to bring to that conversation. It's not just about one thing, and it is about bringing in a whole bunch of different people rather than thinking through just this current tranche of workers that we have to be concerned with.
I'll jump in here too and give you some specific examples because I think it's important to be able to see how that kind of silver bullet ideology plays out in cities. We created something called the Opportunity Calgary Investment Fund as an economic development tool to try to attract businesses to our city, and we fell into the trap of only going after tech-based firms. And what we ended up doing is creating a lot more tech-based companies in the ecosystem, as they call it, instead of thinking about how you could scale up some of the ones that already existed. And it took us a couple of years to learn that lesson. And I think what ends up happening is we get stuck in old ways of thinking about what innovation means and what technology means. I mean, I'm a sociologist, Catherine's an anthropologist. We have a kinship here. We learn all kinds of things in school. We learn quantitative methods. We are amazing statisticians, but people see the word sociology on a resume and go, oh, that person doesn't have the type of skills I'm looking for. So my challenge is to recruiters and to HR departments within major companies. Start figuring out what skill sets people are offering you. And instead of just looking at that 2-page resume, have a 5-minute Zoom call with them. We've gotten used to doing this. Find out if the person has the ability to actually make a cogent argument, and then think about where they can be placed in your company. And that also means that we have to understand how technology has a role to play in the just transition. So just yesterday, there was a project launched called the Compass Project. And a woman named Dr. Alina Turner from Calgary has a company called Help Seekers. She is using that technological advancement to help social sector connect the dots for how people can access the type of help that they need from disparate organizations that otherwise make no sense. So there is an opportunity to use tech and innovation for good in other sectors. We just need to find the ways to do it. And we have been having roundtables since I got elected and sticking weird groupings of people together. We've had the arts and culture sector come and sit down with the social services sector, and folks that are talking about overdose prevention, and people that have commercial real estate. And when they start having conversations about what their common problems are, it's amazing the types of opportunities they identify.
Great, thank you so much. I think probably it's time to wrap up. I apologize, we could not get to all the questions. I did my best to try and curate an interesting discussion and conversation with the panelists. So let me, first of all, thank the panelists, so Gil, Catherine, and Mayor Gondek, for your insights and your thoughts. It was a really engaging and interesting conversation that we've had with you, and we appreciate your time and your ongoing commitment to the energy transition. I also, as we close up this evening, want to thank our sponsors and partners once again. Without them, there is no conference for you to be enjoying. But I want to make sure I make a point of thanking the staff of Parkland Institute for all the work they do, both in putting this conference together and year round. So thanks to Austin Lee and Charlene Oliver for handling the dozens of logistical issues and getting us to this point, and to Rita Braga for handling the communications. And of course, to our executive director, Bill Kilgannon, for working tirelessly to pull this together. And I want to give a particular thank you to one of our research managers, Ian Hussey, and to Tamara Krachenko from the University of Victoria. The two of them did the bulk of the heavy lifting in designing the conference and putting together in the early stages, putting together the SSHRC application and so forth. So the two of them are owed a huge thank you around the efforts that they've put into that. And so I'll just say now as we close off, please join us tomorrow at 9 a.m. Alberta time, where we will have an amazing panel of speakers who will share experiences from other jurisdictions around the world. So this is where we start to get to learn about what other jurisdictions are doing around this and seeing what we can do here in Canada to do that. Thank you all for your time and your Zoom energy tonight. And hopefully we'll see most of you tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Good night.